That's flour, not drugs, and you both know it. Lena Carter didn't scream. She didn't need to. One sentence, cold, sharp as a razor, was enough to make the two white officers freeze. They had just handcuffed a CIA agent in the dead of night in suburban Arlington over failure to yield at an intersection and a bag of white powder that had coincidentally shown up in her trunk. No label, no evidence, just prejudice. They thought she was easy prey, a lone black woman, easy to break. But they had picked the wrong person, completely wrong. Lena didn't just carry credentials, she carried proof, enough to expose an entire racist system rotting from its roots. And those cuffs that night, they didn't restrain her. They unleashed a fury powerful enough to bring down a whole town. Where do you live? In your state. Has anyone ever been treated like Lena just because they didn't look like the majority? Has anyone ever been dragged from their car, cuffed, humiliated over an unmarked bag of white powder? Let us know. Tell your truth. The night streets of Arlington were washed in the faded yellow of aging streetlights, the road markings patchy like the exhausted silence of a small town. Lena Carter drove slowly down the familiar road, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other loosely placed on the gear stick. The black SUV glided through each intersection, its tires whispering against the cold asphalt, like the steady breath of someone well-practiced and calm. She had just left a confidential meeting that dragged past midnight, where every word was encrypted and every glance carried a question mark. Her forehead bore no frown lines, but her eyes held a trace of fatigue. Not from lack of sleep. The streets were empty, no people. Time itself seemed to move sluggishly, almost suffocating, until the piercing wail of a police siren tore through the silence behind her. Lena checked her rear-view mirror. A patrol car was tailing her closely, red and blue lights flashing in a rhythm that felt more like a warning than a routine stop. No intersection, no signs, no clear violation. She didn't pull over right away. Instead, she turned on her signal, slowed down gradually, and stopped at the safest possible spot, under a flickering high-pressure sodium lamp. Two officers stepped out, Brandon Carter, tall, rigid, face like stone, and Mark Sullivan, shorter, stockier, eyes sharp as a blade. They approached slowly, Carter's flashlight beaming into Lena's windshield like it was probing for guilt. Lena didn't flinch. She rolled down the window and met their eyes calmly. "Good evening," Carter said in a tone polished with authority. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" "No idea. I was following the speed limit and traffic signals," Lena answered. Carter claimed she had failed to yield. She calmly replied that she had stopped at the line. Then came Sullivan. "Where are you headed at this hour?" Alone in a residential area, there was judgment in his tone, an accusation wrapped in curiosity. "Just finished work," she said. "What kind of work?" "Freelance." "Freelance is a job now?" Carter added with a steel-edged smirk. The tension held, tight but controlled. Lena didn't raise her voice, didn't back down. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she knew that in their eyes, wrongness wasn't about breaking the law. It was about who you were, where you stood, and what color your skin was. She watched the way Carter kept the flashlight trained on her face longer than necessary, the way Sullivan peered into her car without justification. They hadn't asked for ID, they hadn't stated a legitimate reason. They were waiting for fear or anger or anything that might give them cause. But Lena stayed still. Her calm was the only weapon she needed, and that calm made them uneasy. A black woman in a nice car, speaking clearly, not apologizing, panicking, didn't fit the story they wanted. She said less, waited longer. She knew silence makes men like them impatient, and impatience always leads to mistakes. She wasn't hoping for fairness. She was waiting for a crack to open. Carter cleared his throat, as if to reassert control. "Pop the trunk," he said. "No warrant, no reason, just the power to ask and expect compliance." Lena didn't protest. Questions would only provoke. She nodded, stepped out slowly, not in submission but with control. Carter followed her. Sullivan moved to the rear. "I smell something," Sullivan said sharply, recoiling like a dog on instinct. "Something's off. Emergency search. I'm not risking exposure to contraband." No further explanation. No real cause, just a well-rehearsed script. Sullivan opened the trunk. Inside, a single small plastic bag, unmarked, unhidden. He lifted it like treasure. "Got it. She's hiding something." Carter looked in, eyebrows rising in practiced surprise. No one asked Lena a thing. This wasn't about discovery. It was about performance. Lena didn't move. She didn't react. The light cast half her face in shadow. No panic, no outrage, no fear. When Sullivan held up the bag, she finally spoke, voice low, firm, not defensive. "It's flour, and you know that." No defiance, no sarcasm, just a simple, undeniable truth. And that was what made Carter pause. He had seen fear. He had seen pleading. He had seen people break. But this calm, cutting stillness was different. They cuffed her. No sound, no struggle. Lena let her arms be pulled back, her gaze still locked on Carter. Not hate, just something like a warning. And in that moment he hesitated, not because of guilt, not because of fear of being wrong, but because he saw, in that unblinking silence, that she had expected this. And worse, he had just triggered something that couldn't be undone. The patrol car rolled forward. Red and blue lights flashed from the roof, cutting through the night road like open wounds that refused to close. Lena sat in the back seat, hands cuffed behind her, spine straight, eyes fixed ahead. No pane of glass could block her gaze. It pierced mist, lights, even the false mask of the man in front of her. Carter drove in silence, though his grip on the wheel wasn't relaxed. Sullivan, riding shotgun, twisted halfway to look at her, eyes full of smug satisfaction. "Not many people stay this calm," he said, voice slow and half-mocking. "But trust me, after a night in a cell, everyone cries." Lena didn't answer. Her silence wasn't defiance, but choice. She refused to be pulled into the game where they made up the rules. Her gaze never shifted, but every sound, every movement, Carter's touch on the gas, the brake, was logged in her mind like muscle memory. She didn't need a watch to track time or turns. Her senses had taken over long ago. The car stopped at the station. Carter pulled Lena out, not harshly but firmly enough to show control. She didn't resist or speak. They brought her through the main entrance, past an empty lobby lit by buzzing fluorescent lights, and a coffee counter gone cold since the start of the shift. The desk officer looked up, then quickly down again, too familiar a sight to care. They led her through intake, name, photo, prints, questioning. Carter signed the log. Sullivan dropped the bag of evidence like a trophy. Lena scanned the room discreetly. Half the security cameras were dead. The emergency exit was without a biometric lock. Outdated land-based server. She didn't need to touch anything to know. This place ran on routine, not security. That made it easier to crack. A young officer stepped out holding a tablet. Hair cropped high, uniform still crisp. His name tag read James Keller, slightly crooked, worn only a few times. He paused when he saw Lena, not because she was a woman or attractive, but because she was utterly still, a kind of stillness unlike any detainee he'd seen. "New intake?" he asked Carter. "Yeah, she's yours," Carter said, glancing at Lena. "She knows the rules. Be careful, Keller." Lena heard that. She knew that kind of warning, not because Keller might mess up, but because they didn't want him thinking too hard. Sullivan removed the cuffs and motioned her to place her hand on the scanner. Her hands were cold, but didn't tremble. Keller opened the intake form. When he reached occupation, he hesitated. Lena met his eyes. "Freelance?" she said, not fearful, just ready. The night inside the station was quiet. Stale coffee, keyboard clicks. Rookie James Keller, months on the force, processed the intake. He'd seen all kinds, begging faces, desperate pleas, cold sweats in interrogation. They blurred together, people gripped by fear, often unsure why they were even there. But Lena was different. From the start, her eyes weren't anxious, they observed, calm and precise, like she was assessing a scene not being processed. She placed her hand on the scanner with perfect precision. No extra movement, no guidance needed. Her eyes glided past his keyboard, the cameras, the frosted meeting room window, not looking to escape. Not resigned, either. Keller felt like she was studying the place as an inspector, not a suspect. Height? He asked. 167. Occupation? Freelance. Same tone, same pace, but something about her presence felt like a test, and he was the one being graded. Sullivan slumped into a chair, legs up like it was a movie break. He smirked. You should thank us for not calling the dogs. If Lucky had sniffed that bag, you wouldn't be filling out forms right now. Lena turned slightly, gaze unreadable. Amusement or pity? Keller opened his mouth to say something, but Carter walked in with the coffee, steam still rising. He perched on the desk edge, took a sip like savoring a win. You done? He asked Keller, eyes never leaving Lena. Almost, Keller replied, trying to keep steady. Lena signed. Her signature was clean, tight. No flare. Under the dim yellow light, the ink stood out like a stamp of undeniable presence. When she looked up, Keller saw her smile, barely there. Not mocking, not a smirk used to mask shame. It was a quiet declaration. Subtle, but deep. Not proud, but no one would call it pleasant. Keller froze. He'd never been unsettled by a smile before, not threatened, but pulled out of his comfort zone. And for the first time since wearing a badge, he felt a tiny, unshakable crack inside. He looked at Lena, at Carter, too relaxed with his coffee, at Sullivan, still tapping a foot like waiting for a final move, and Lena, saying nothing, resisting nothing, only watching, was the one making it all feel off. Keller couldn't explain it, but he knew something here wasn't right, not from the woman in cuffs, from the ones holding them. Holding cell No. 3 was tucked away at the end of a hallway, the kind of place no one wandered into without a purpose. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above like a mosquito in the stillness of confinement. Lena sat at the edge of a cold metal bench, back straight, eyes fixed on the stained wall ahead. The iron door was shut, but not double-locked. She hadn't caused any trouble. She looked like someone on a break during a shift, not like someone under federal arrest. A night officer walked by, glanced through the door slot, and moved on, as if he'd seen only a shadow. Then Keller appeared, carrying a cup of water and a printout of the case details for her signature. He stopped at the door, hand on the metal bar, eyes meeting hers. The same eyes he hadn't been able to categorize since last night. Would you like some water? He asked softly, almost politely. Lena nodded. He slid the drink through the slot. As she took it, their hands nearly touched, and a slight chill ran through him. Not fear, just the eerie sense of acting in a scene someone else had written. She sipped, set the cup aside, then looked straight at him. Officer Keller, she said evenly, do you believe you're doing the right thing? It wasn't accusatory, not even skeptical, just a plain question. And because of that, it cut sharper than anything else could have. Keller paused, glanced at her, then looked down at the papers in his hand. I'm just doing my duty, he replied. The words came automatically, but he himself felt how hollow they were. Lena's lips curved slightly. Not a smirk, but something that brushed against sympathy. I didn't ask what your duty is, I asked if you believe in it. Keller inhaled quietly, keeping still. The documents in his hands now felt like they weighed tons, not from the ink, but from the question pressing down on him. He answered like an officer. If there's been a mistake, my superiors will handle it. Lena's gaze narrowed, sharp but calm. Are your superiors the kind of people who would come in here, look me in the eye, and say with certainty that I had drugs on me? Keller had no reply. For a second, it felt like a courtroom, and he was already on the witness stand. Turning back to the wall, Lena spoke again, her voice casual. My name on file is Lena Carter, but do you think that name is all you know about me? Keller tightened his lips. He wasn't afraid of her, but of what she was stripping bare, his passivity. Who are you? He asked quietly. She didn't look at him, just smiled. A smile without label, not triumphant, not defiant, just reflective. "I'm what this system can't predict," she whispered. "And the scariest thing for those who write the laws is when they arrest someone who can read them better than they can." Silence hung heavy. Keller stepped back, gripping the file tighter. He didn't ask for more, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time, he no longer saw her as a suspect, but as a question the entire system wasn't ready to answer. On Lena's wrist, just beneath the skin marked by the steel cuffs, there was a thin patch of synthetic skin no larger than a fingernail. When the hallway light hit it, it didn't reflect, didn't protrude, no different from a regular dark spot on her skin, but with a single press of a nail at the right angle, the device underneath would send out a triple encrypted signal, enough to trigger a trace sequence from the monitoring station. Lena knew the system would take at least 10 minutes to sync, and in that time, she had to keep everything calm. She activated it in the dark as she was being led out of the cell for shoe print processing. No one noticed. No one suspected a thing. A slight tilt of the hand, a half step out of sync, every move came straight from her training more than 10 years ago. But this wasn't just another mission. No one in the CIA was trained to wait for extraction after being arrested for the color of their skin. In the break room near the public intake lobby, Carter was telling a story. It was about a spectacular bust in a West Arlington parking lot, where a 17-year-old black kid was caught transporting 2 bags of ecstasy in his mom's trunk. "Dumb as hell," he sneered, pouring more coffee. "Tried to call a lawyer when we cuffed him. Like that's going to save him from the video I recorded myself." Sullivan let out a harsh laugh, propping his feet on the table. "Should have signed him up for the K-9 training list. Kids these days don't even flinch around cops anymore." Neither of them knew Lena had been listening through the internal surveillance system. The very system they assumed no one cared about. She didn't need to record. She just needed confirmation. They'd done this before. Repeatedly. Same pattern, same outcome. And each successful case added another piece to the evidence trail she'd been building for the past 6 months. The Arlington police system wasn't designed to hide things cleverly. Quite the opposite. It thrived on negligence. Carter and Sullivan didn't alter records. They didn't forge forms. They just added to what was already there, letting the system process everything itself. Lena had reviewed dozens of arrests before arriving in this town. 89% stemmed from vague traffic violations. 91% of suspects were people of color. And strangest of all, a disproportionately high rate of narcotics discoveries in a town of fewer than 30,000 residents. She'd reported it to the Domestic Intelligence Analysis Unit, but no official investigation had been authorized. The case was too minor for budget priority, too clean to spark controversy. Only by becoming a victim herself could Lena's data have a chance of being acted on. And she knew to make that happen, she first had to let herself be arrested. The signal had just been sent. A blue light no bigger than a pen tip blinked once, then vanished. Lena stood up and walked toward the door. She didn't knock, just stood there. Outside, the hallway surveillance system registered movement. A clerk passing by glanced in, considered entering, then moved on, because inside was just a suspect. One of the ceiling lights flickered off, then came back on. He stared at it without blinking. 10 minutes. In the next 10 minutes, the CIA's tech team would know her location, and within 4 hours, if protocol held, another organization with no badges, no patrol cars, would approach Arlington City Hall. The only remaining question was, how many more cracks would this system expose before everything unraveled? In a room 3 doors away, Carter was still laughing. He spoke to Sullivan with smug confidence. "She's calm, sure, but that never lasts. The smart ones who fake composure break faster than the criers." Sullivan nodded, flipping through a stack of files. He stopped at one page. "Wait, this name, I remember the girl from last week. She also listed independent consultant as her job. Coincidence?" Carter waved it off. "So what? They all say stuff like that. Not like they're going to write petty dealer on the forms." But Sullivan didn't laugh. A hint of doubt crept into his voice. Lena had planted the seed, and now they were repeating the very behavior that made them most vulnerable. overconfidence and consistency. Keller sat alone in the control room, the glow from a single screen casting shadows across his face, which was tightening with focus. The monitor displayed a list of recent arrests made by Patrol Unit 3, the unit alternately led by Carter and Sullivan. During night shifts, no one paid attention to a rookie officer, without enough clout to make waves. But Keller was quietly stepping out of the safe shell he had clung to. The night Lena Carter was brought into the station, something cracked open, not because she did anything dramatic, but because she did nothing at all. And that silence echoed in his mind, like a siren. The suspects Keller had processed in the past always showed clear signs of panic, confusion, and desperate reactions. But Lena didn't. She didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't comply. She just remembered and watched, as if the person locked in the cell was the observer, and the ones outside the bars were the ones being watched. The deeper Keller dug into the data, the colder his spine felt. In the span of 8 months, Carter and Sullivan had filed a total of 47 arrests for traffic violations leading to discovery of illegal substances. Of those, 42 suspects were people of color. Over 90% were found with unlabeled bags of drugs in their trunks, and almost all, including one eerily consistent line, suspect appeared nervous, hesitant, provided unlegal statements. It was too perfect, too smooth, like a pre-written paragraph being copied over and over again across time. Keller clicked through each report. Names, ages, occupations, independent consultant, contract worker, self-mated, jobs without regular pay stubs, impossible to verify within a few hours, lives that could be easily detached from the system and labeled suspicious. He took a deep breath, feeling as though every detail was filling the room with a suffocating, invisible weight. While Keller wrestled with what he had just uncovered, Lena sat in the holding cell like someone in meditation. No unnecessary movement, no complaints. But her eyes remained open and alert. She noticed the night staff's shift change was 15 minutes late, noticed the keycard reader at the technical entrance had stopped working, noticed Carter passing by her cell 3 times an hour, not out of duty, but to study her reaction. And each time, Lena remained still, unmoving. She knew he was the one being rattled. Someone like Carter wasn't used to silence, didn't understand how a person could be caged without losing direction. And when control through authority fails, the instinct to dominate starts revealing its cracks. She didn't need to break out. She just needed to wait. When Keller returned to the processing area, printed files in hand, he walked slower than usual. Those pages felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Not because of thickness, but because of the look Lena had given him the night before. Do you really believe you're doing the right thing? At the time, it was just a precise cut, but now it had become a leak, seeping through every folder on the hard drive. He didn't know what he would do next. He didn't have the authority to launch an investigation, didn't have enough evidence to charge anyone. But he knew staying silent now was a choice, and it was no longer harmless. He walked down the hallway, glancing through the frosted window. Lena was still there, motionless, the light from the security camera angling across her cheek. She turned her face away just as he looked in. No greeting, no signal, but Keller felt it. They were both stepping into a battle that could only be won by saying nothing at all. On the 3rd basement level of an unmarked building on the northern edge of Washington, D.C., the control room was lit not by lamps, but by dozens of screens mounted across 4 walls. The only sounds were the steady hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic clatter of keyboards, a wordless symphony played by people who never appear in the news. A small blinking dot suddenly lit up in the top left corner of the central monitor, an active location signal from a domestically embedded asset. No one in the room asked, "What is that?" Because everyone here understood the only reason a CIA operative would activate their tracker within U.S. borders was if the system they trusted had begun to betray its own. A man in a gray shirt, no tie, no name tag, stepped closer to the console. His eyes didn't leave the blinking dot. "Codename Bravo 6 has triggered a Level 2 signal," he said quietly, barely above a breath. "Position, stable. Delay, 9 minutes and 12 seconds. The female technician beside him confirmed. Coordinates match Arlington County holding facility. Target is stationary, no resistance. No resistance? The man repeated, frowning slightly. He wasn't doubting Lena. No one in the Omega Tier field team doubted her after 3 years of transnational operations. But her silence, while being framed, was a signal of something larger. She wasn't trying to escape. She was waiting for the enemy to expose itself. In the data archive behind the control room, footage of Lena's arrest had already been pulled from the internal satellite system, still maintaining remote surveillance over active agent zones. They reviewed the video of Carter opening the trunk, his hand resting on the conveniently placed white powder bag in the far right corner. No verbal search warrant, no authorization, no body cam footage, a blank spot, unnoticed by civilians but treated as gold by intelligence officers. A young CIA operative at the dispatch desk flipped through files so fast the paper hissed. Brandon Carter, Patrol Unit 3, logged 37 drug arrests in the past 12 months. Prosecution rate 100%. All suspects were ethnic minorities. The man in gray raised an eyebrow. The system knows this? It does, the technician replied. But there are no formal complaints. All suspects either confessed or waived counsel. The cleaner it looks, the more it stinks, he concluded. Lena wasn't caught in a mistake. She was embedded to determine whether the mistake was personal or systemic. Before Arlington, she had infiltrated 4 other towns with similar arrest patterns, but this place stood out. The concentration of suspects, the manipulation of reports, the speed at which public defender responses disappeared. 3 weeks before her arrest, Lena submitted an internal report stating, "The law enforcement network in Arlington shows signs of criminal justice manipulation through legalized arbitrary arrests. Recommend activating field verification under live scenario." That report was why she was authorized to play the role of a potential suspect, with full control over when to trigger the signal. Back in the control room, no one spoke of a rescue. Lena didn't need rescuing. She needed a precisely timed intervention from an authority higher than the local level. So when the data was clear enough, the counter-strike wouldn't just take down 2 officers, but the entire machinery that enabled them. "Connect with the Domestic Legal Task Force," the man ordered. "Prep an expanded analysis team. Arlington may be just one link in the chain." Another technician reached up and adjusted the signal console. There were no cheers, no slogans, only silence, cold and precise, like a needle slipping under the skin, leaving no trace but altering the bloodstream. Lena had gone in under a false identity, but now she no longer needed to hide. The system itself was peeling off its own mask, layer by layer. Keller had lost count of how many times he stared back at his computer screen. The email draft still open. The subject line was brief, urgent, possible pattern of misconduct at Arlington PD. His hands trembled, not from fear of being caught, but because he wasn't even sure what he was doing. The attached files list over 30 arrests, with strikingly similar patterns, all conducted by Carter and Sullivan within the past year. He had scrubbed all metadata, routed his connection through proxies, and created a temporary email account using a foreign encryption server. In his mind, this was the act of a conscientious citizen. But deep down, Keller knew it was also the act of someone about to be seen as a traitor. He waited a few moments. The cursor hovered over the send button. Finally, he took a breath and clicked. The screen flickered. The email vanished. 1 second, 2. Nothing happened. He sat still in his small office, the ceiling light above him flickering slowly, almost hesitantly. Outside in the hallway, Carter walked by, footsteps steady and certain, as if he still believed he stood on untouchable ground. Keller lowered his head to the desk, fingers interlaced, eyes half closed. He didn't know what would happen next. He only knew one thing: he had just stepped beyond the safety his uniform once offered, and there was no going back. At that very moment, inside a domestic operations command center monitoring Lena Carter, a technician received a system alert. An email had been sent from a civilian server, simple encryption, but containing flagged keywords that matched a CIA strategic filter chain. Brandon Carter, Mark Sullivan, planted evidence. Arlington PD. Racial bias. She didn't open the email. She flagged it, forwarded it to the domestic risk link team, and activated a silent Level 1 alert. An internal security analyst glanced at the screen, frowning. Who sent it? Known. Anonymous burner email. Might be internal movement. A man in a gray shirt stepped closer, skimming the content. Nothing beyond what they already suspected, but that was precisely what made him smile. It came sooner than expected. Lena did it. They had no plans to interfere with civilian email systems. But this wasn't just a whistleblower message. It was the first real sign that something inside had cracked. Someone on the inside had seen the truth and acted willingly, and if one person could do that, there would be a second. After that, the system could no longer stay sealed. All Lena needed was a leak, an ethical fracture deep enough to make the power structure go on the defense. And Keller, through nothing but his own sincerity, had unknowingly become the first strike in a psychological campaign. Not fired with bullets, but with conscience. Lena never knew exactly who would act, but she knew. If she asked the right question to the right person at the right moment, the system would fracture on its own. She didn't need to reveal her real name. She didn't need to convince Keller. All she had to do was plant the seed of doubt. The rest he would do himself. In her cell, Lena leaned her head against the wall, eyes on the ceiling. She didn't hear any alarm, but deep inside she knew. The first bomb had gone off, silent but deep. The next morning, just as the Arlington police station lit up with the new shift, a black unmarked vehicle slowly pulled up to the main entrance. No sirens, no urgency, no signal requesting entry. Its movement was silent but resolute. 3 men in dark suits stepped out. No name tags, no insignia. No one at the station had been notified in advance, and that was deliberate. When someone with enough authority arrived, they don't need permission to be noticed. They only need to show up, and the world adjusts itself to their rhythm. The man leading them had salt and pepper hair, walked with a measured but firm pace. His eyes never lingered long enough on anyone to invite challenge, because they weren't there to ask. They were there to record, to assess, to judge, in silence. Carter had just poured his second cup of coffee when he saw them. He froze for a beat as the salt and pepper-held man swept his eyes across the front desk. No one introduced themselves. No one stated their purpose. They simply handed over a white sheet with a QR code, and the on-duty officer stood up immediately, as if by instinct. "We require temporary access to the internal surveillance system," one of the 3 said, his voice low and stripped of any regional tone. Not threatening, not explanatory, and precisely because of that, no one dared to refuse. Within 3 minutes, they had moved through the main corridor, entered the data room, and taken seats at the surveillance desk, where Keller usually handled the night shift. They didn't seize control. They didn't interrogate anyone. They simply opened the cameras, the stored footage, and began to observe in silence. But from that moment on, the atmosphere in the station had completely changed. The presence of 3 strangers, without badges yet with full system access, sent a ripple through the station. Carter passed by the observation room and tried to glance in but didn't dare stop. Sullivan joked at first but fell silent once the meeting room door locked from the inside. Others, those unrelated to the previous night's shift, began to act more cautiously. Lena remained in her cell, but she sensed the change instantly. The hallway door made a different sound, shifting from the familiar sharp steps of known officers to the muffled silence of those who walked without needing to be announced. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing at the thin line of light under the door. She didn't need to see their faces. She only needed to know they had arrived. And they hadn't come to rescue her. They came to witness. Keller was summoned to a small office in the back, where the salt and pepper-haired man was reviewing the footage from Lena's arrest. "You were the one processing Lena Carter's case file?" he asked, without notes, without opening a folder. Keller nodded, his throat dry. "Did you have any doubts during the process?" A simple question, but so calm it made Keller's heart thump harder. He hesitated for a beat, then nodded. "Yes." The man didn't react, just turned back to the screen and paused the video at the moment Lena was handcuffed. Her face showed no fear. He pointed to the image. "Someone like her doesn't get arrested by accident." One sentence. Short, clear, and enough for Keller to understand. He wasn't the first to notice something was off. He was merely the one she had led to see it. And from that moment forward, every procedure inside Arlington Station no longer belonged to Carter or to any of the officers there. Courtroom 4 of the Arlington District Trial Court had never witnessed a morning quite so quiet. No angry crowds, no reporters jostling in the hallway, just creaky old benches, pale ceiling lights, and a few scattered strangers seated silently in the back rows. Lena wasn't let in through the side door reserved for defendants. She entered through the main entrance, passing by the prosecutor and court clerk like any attending citizen. Unchained, unbound. A uniformed officer walked beside her, slowly, without touching her shoulder. According to later documentation, this was a temporary directive from a higher authority, unnamed and without a reference code. The pale gray prison attire didn't make Lena seem smaller. On the contrary, the overhead light cast a sharp, defined shadow around her as she stood at the defendant's podium. Across from her, Prosecutor McConnell, long regarded as cautious to the point of boredom, held a pre-clipped file. His voice was steady, unbroken. Defendant Lena Carter, born on, as per records obtained at the scene, is charged with violating Traffic Regulation 24AA, involving failure to comply with intersection signage. The defendant is also charged under Narcotics Control Code 445B with aggravating circumstances due to an unidentified powder substance found in the trunk of her vehicle. The words dragged on, as if even he didn't expect anyone to truly listen, just to complete the routine, as he had done for hundreds of names before. Lena did not react. She didn't frown, didn't lift her head, didn't glance around. She just stood there, silent as a rock in a flowing river. But that very silence made the room heavier with every word of the indictment. No interruptions, no objections, and no signs of acceptance. When the prosecutor finished, Judge Travers, who had presided from the bench for nearly 2 decades, looked up from his paperwork, adjusted his glasses, and asked, "Does the defendant accept court-appointed counsel?" He stared directly at Lena, eyes unblinking, as if trying to detect the slightest crack in her expression. But there was nothing to hold on to. Lena gave a slight nod, then spoke. Her voice rang clear, not loud, but sharp. "I will represent myself." The room paused. McConnell looked up for the first time since opening the file. Judge Travers furrowed his brow slightly, as though he had seen defendants attempt to self-represent before, but none quite like this. On the second floor, where the observers' seats were located, 3 plainclothes men sat with no visible IDs, no presented credential. One had been seen at the Arlington precinct the night Lena was arrested. The second held a compact note-taking device. The third hadn't taken his eyes off Lena since she walked in. None of them moved. None whispered to each other. They just watched, as if what was happening below wasn't a hearing, but a test. Keller sat quietly in the back of the room. He didn't know why he had asked to attend, only that when he heard Lena would be in court that morning, his legs moved on their own. And when he heard her say, "I will represent myself," a chill ran down his spine, not from fear, but from the realization this woman didn't need rescuing. She was the one directing the entire stage. Her words dropped into the courtroom like acid onto the surface of an old wooden desk, small, quiet, but corrosive to every layer of calm trying to hold steady. "You arrested the wrong person. Not because I'm innocent, but because I'm not ordinary." No one in the room fully grasped the meaning, but everyone felt something had just veered violently off the path they thought they controlled. Judge Travers looked up from his files, squinting. He meant to ask for clarification, but Lena had already stood upright, arms at her sides, and her voice didn't need repeating. Each word had been delivered with a confidence no law book or courtroom training could teach. Prosecutor McConnell tilted his neck slightly, an eyebrow twitching. He was not easily rattled, but in that moment, he realized he was facing a type of person the legal system had no language for. He looked up toward the second-floor gallery, hoping to catch a reaction from the 3 strangers, and that made him even more uneasy. They weren't reacting, no note-taking, no side glances. just watching, and seemingly already aware of what Lena was going to say. Carter, seated at the back, leaned forward, elbows on knees. The moment Lena spoke, he had jolted slightly, then froze. Beside him, Sullivan shifted like he meant to scoff, but ended up just inhaling. Neither could explain the sudden cold in their spines. Maybe it was because they'd seen hundreds of people cry, plead, swear innocence, but never someone flip the very concept of being arrested with a single sentence. No defiance, no denial, just a kind of declaration, clear as an official seal on a final document. I don't fall under the laws you enforce. Keller's breathing slowed. Though seated far back, every word Lena said felt like it hit his chest directly. He never looked away from her. In that moment, every doubt he'd had consolidated into a truth he couldn't yet name but was sure of. This woman hadn't come to be exonerated. She came to redefine the very meaning of justice that they all believed in. At the clerk's desk, a young woman in a pale blouse picked up the file the prosecutor had placed down. Name: Lena Carter, female. Registered at an address in Fairfax, Virginia. ID file number, a seemingly valid string of digits. She typed into the federal index system, a routine task. The data loaded slower than usual. She searched again, then a third time. Her face began to pale. The system returned a red message. No matching record found. Please verify data. She glanced toward the judge, who was making notes, unaware that the clerk had stopped mid-keystroke. She cross-hectored the Arlington Precinct's temporary intake file. Result: no matching arrest in the federal system. No one named Lena Carter had been detained in Virginia in the last 48 hours. No one with that ID number had valid registration. No one. Nothing. She didn't report it immediately, just bowed her head, pressed her lips together, and shielded the screen with a thick stack of files. But her heart pounded, because even though she was too young to grasp the full consequences, she knew one thing: the system no longer had control over the person standing in the middle of that courtroom. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom after the clerk failed to locate the federal file on the defendant. Judge Travers hadn't yet noticed the disruption unfolding behind the scenes, but the instinct of a man who'd presided over hundreds of cases made him narrow his eyes and set his pen down. "Ms. Carter," he said, voice dropping as if testing the ground, "you've chosen to represent yourself. Do you have anything to present to the court?" Lena looked up. Her face remained unreadable, but her eyes were sharper, glowing brighter than when she entered. "I do," she said. "I'll begin by proving that you didn't arrest me. You staged an arrest." McConnell's mouth twitched, ready to object, but Lena had already stepped forward to the small table in the center of the courtroom. She opened the bag handed to her the previous night, assumed to hold only personal effects. From it, she pulled a small device resembling a portable hard drive, but equipped with multi-tiered data ports. A specialized USB. No hesitation. She plugged it into the courtroom's presentation port, usually reserved for attorneys. Judge Travers frowned, about to speak, but McConnell instinctively raised a hand, as if to keep the air still. An image appeared. No fast-forward, no edits. A night vision clip, captured from a low angle, was probably placed near the vehicle's floor. The footage was clear. Carter opened a patrol car trunk. Sullivan stood behind him, holding an unmarked white bag. Carter took it, turned, and walked toward Lena's SUV. They hadn't even approached the vehicle, yet the bag was already in their hands. No words, no orders, no procedure. Then, Carter opened Lena's trunk, placing the bag inside. The video lasted only 18 seconds, but it collapsed the entire case. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. McConnell turned pale and looked toward the judge. Trevor stayed silent, jaw tight. A police officer in the far left corner shot up, then sank back into his seat, as if something invisible pressed him down. On the second floor, 3 plainclothes men stared at the screen without blinking. The one in the middle tilted his head and typed something into a device. Carter froze. He looked from the footage to Lena, his eyes now filled with a swirl of confusion and fear. Beside him, Sullivan inched backward, mouth open, speechless, like comedians who'd stepped onto the wrong stage and found themselves in a court-martial. Lena didn't look back. She stood still, arms crossed, the screen's light casting a soft glow on her hair. "That was Exhibit 1, she said, her voice like steel. "I have 4 more clips, but I think this is enough to turn the question around. Who's the real criminal in this room?" She didn't raise her voice, but each word landed with the weight of iron. McConnell began to stammer about the origin of the footage, but Lena had already removed the USB and slipped it back into her bag. "Origin?" she repeated, eyes fixed and steady. "I filmed it. The device was embedded in my car before I ever arrived in Arlington." A pause. "I didn't come here to be arrested. I came to see how long it would take before you crushed the very laws you swore to uphold." No one walked into that courtroom expecting a procedural hearing to become a surgical dissection of the justice system itself. There were no cameras flashing, no journalists swarming the steps, just the usual stillness of a weekday session, the quiet scrape of shoes on old floors, the low hum of murmurs before the judge arrived. But when Lena Carter was called back to the stand, this time not with a shaky video or defiant testimony, but with a thick, worn binder, hand-labeled in black ink, the atmosphere shifted. The room didn't know it yet, but it was about to stop breathing. "I requested a review of the last 47 arrests made by Officers Carter and Sullivan over the past 12 months. Lena began, her voice firm but devoid of theatrics. She didn't glance down at the pages. She didn't need to. Out of those, 39 cases went to trial before the same judge. She paused, looked up at the courtroom, and delivered the name like a scalpel. Judge Roy Dillard. The name landed with weight. It didn't ripple. It sank. In Virginia's legal circles, Roy Dillard was practically institutional, revered, feared, a judge whose reputation for punishing low-level drug offenses had been cemented over decades. He once publicly declared, "Letting a drug carrier go is opening the door for a poisoned generation." It was a statement framed on office walls, quoted in legal seminars. It had been his brand. And now, that same name was sitting at the center of a growing web of scrutiny. Lena flipped open a chart. It wasn't fancy, just printed lines, manually highlighted paths, red marker circles, but the simplicity only sharpened its impact. Every arrest, every court date, every sentence. Match rate between arresting officers and presiding judge, over 83%, she said. Incarceration rate, 100%. No suspended sentences. No rehabilitation alternatives. Not a single downward departure. The silence in the courtroom thickened. Prosecutor McConnell leaned forward, ready to object, but Lena was already ahead. With a quiet click, the projector lit up. The screen showed one case in particular. Defendant Malik Reese. Black, male, age 28, arrested by Officer Sullivan for possession with intent to distribute, but then came the break. Lena's trump card. Footage from an ATM camera 2 blocks away, time-stamped to the exact minute Malik was allegedly being detained. There he was, withdrawing cash, calm, unaware, alone. The timestamp had been verified. The footage submitted to the court before trial, and still, Judge Dillard had recessed the hearing for 3 minutes, then returned to sentence Malik to 18 months in prison. Whispers swept through the gallery. They didn't sound shocked. They sounded betrayed. Lena didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The numbers, the visuals, the absurdity of it all, the clean contradiction did her speaking for her. On the second level of the courtroom, one of the plainclothes observers, sitting quiet until now, tilted his head and scribbled something into a notebook. Below him, McConnell was frozen. So was Judge Trevors. His hand paused mid-sip above a glass of water. Everyone in the room knew who Dillard was. Many had once sat at his table, called him colleague, or whispered about his ironclad courtroom behind closed doors. Now, none of them said a word. Lena wasn't finished. She opened a second folder. This one thinner but heavier in implication. It wasn't filled with case files. It contained video stills, frames pulled from courtroom surveillance footage, never made public, never released beyond judicial archives. The image on the screen was low resolution but clear enough. An empty courtroom, morning light filtering in. Judge Roy Dillard standing near a man in a gray suit, the prosecutor from a case where the accused had been convicted without evidence, without witnesses. The video had no sound, but Lena brought what the CIA called verified lip-read analysis. The subtitles played across the image. No need to drag it out. 3 minutes is enough. Just don't reveal when the footage surfaced. A collective gasp didn't come. Instead, a deeper stillness spread, like something sacred had cracked. Judge Travers didn't blink. McConnell turned pale. Members of the audience murmured, some shaking their heads slowly, others too stunned to move. Lena let the frame sit there, suspended on the projection screen like a ripped-open wound. Upstairs, the lead plainclothes observer leaned in toward the court clerk, whispered a single instruction. She nodded, retrieved a small device from her bag, and quietly left the room. No noise, no announcement. But within 15 minutes, a file bearing the name Roy Dillard would be opened. Not by the media, not by civil attorneys, but by the federal judiciary's internal review board. They hadn't come to observe, they'd come to verify. And Lena Carter had just given them proof. When a judge is placed under scrutiny, every ruling he ever signed returns to the surface, and nothing is off limits. At the rear of the room, James Keller sat frozen. He watched the courtroom not as a witness, but as someone whose entire worldview was unraveling in real time. He had once sworn by this system, trusted it, built his purpose around it, and now he was watching it collapse, layer by layer, because one woman stood alone and refused to let it stand any longer. Lena returned to the stand. She didn't adjust her notes. She didn't look back at the screen. Her gaze fixed on the front row, where 3 men, once adorned in black robes, long untouchable, sat unblinking. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but sharp enough to pierce every corner of the room. Justice doesn't die from lack of laws. It dies because too many people sit in the wrong seats. No one laughed. No one dared offer a rebuttal. The sentence cut across the system like a blade across fabric. Neat, final, and undeniable. From that day forward, in Arlington, the name Roy Dillard would never be spoken the same way again. Keller sat at the head of the long conference table, facing 3 gray-suited members of Internal Affairs. No badges, no smiles, no sign of emotion. On the table lay copies of the arrest report for Lena Carter and several annotated records he had entered by hand. Under the harsh white ceiling light and the frosted glass wall behind them, Keller didn't feel like he was in a meeting. He felt like he was being examined under a microscope. The man in the center spoke first. "Officer Keller, you're not here as a defendant. However, there are matters that need clarification, specifically regarding your handling of the intake file on the night Lena Carter was arrested." His tone wasn't harsh, but it was steady to the point of chilling. "Have you ever suspected that file, or any file you've entered, might have been inaccurate?" Keller hesitated. The answer, which had seemed ready just moments ago, caught in his throat. Part of it was fear. A larger part was the fact that he now had to face himself. "At the time, I didn't notice anything wrong," Keller replied, eyes locked on the table, unable to look up. One of the other 2, a woman with thin, metal-framed glasses, flipped through a stack of paper. "You processed 14 cases in the past 6 months, involving Carter and Sullivan. All of them followed the same structure. Did you notice that?" Keller nodded. The next question came like a blade. "Then why didn't you report it, request a cross-check, notify a superior?" He remained silent, not because he lacked an answer, but because he didn't dare speak the truth, because he had noticed. He had doubted briefly, but he told himself, probably not. Probably they had a reason. Probably he was just the new guy and didn't understand the full picture. Probably. And now those probabilities stacked into a mountain collapsing on top of him in this sealed, airless room. The room was closed. The air was thick, like bricks. Outside were his colleagues, people who now looked at him as if he carried a disease. Inside were 3 strangers who held the power to erase his career with a single paragraph. But worse than all of them was the voice in his own head, whispering throughout the hearing, You saw, but you said nothing. They didn't need to press him anymore. Keller was already cutting himself open from the inside. He remembered each case, every name in those files, every line that read, "Suspect showed suspicious behavior." Every time he clicked confirm, and never once flagged irregularity. The faces that had flickered across his screen now turned back to stare at him, not accusingly, but as if to ask, "You were there. Why did you let them convict me?" And in that moment, Keller knew he could no longer claim he was clean. The air in the hearing room hadn't yet cooled after the barrage of questions when one of the three investigators received a notification through his earpiece. He covered the mic, leaned toward his colleague, and whispered a few brief words. The woman with glasses nodded, opened the laptop in front of her, and retrieved a newly arrived file. On the screen appeared a short audio clip, less than a minute long. Basic encryption, verified source device. It had been submitted to the internal investigation system with a single-line note. What needs to be heard? No justification needed. No one in the room had been warned. Keller looked up, hands still clasped, eyes clouded with tension. The woman tapped the keyboard. The audio began. It was Lena's voice. Calm, low, clear, each word beating like a steady heart with nothing to prove. "I've watched many people in this system. Some lower their heads the moment they're caught. Some hold theirs high because they've got nothing left to lose. And some choose to remain still, silent, uncooperative, but also not resisting. They're not heroes, but they're the only sign the system isn't completely dead. On the night I was arrested, the person who entered my file was James Keller, and if the records are correct, he's the only one out of 47 cases who didn't alter timestamps, didn't stack charges, didn't change suspect status." Her voice paused deliberately. "I don't know what Keller plans to do with that choice, but I want this recorded. He didn't lie." No sound followed, no music, just silence, long and weighty, like a shaft of light slicing through dust. Keller sat frozen, hands rigid, as if he'd just heard someone read out the version of himself he'd once hoped still existed. He didn't know when she'd recorded it or why she sent it now. But he understood one thing. It was the last lifeline in a room with no exits. An investigator nearby flipped through the report, checked the logs, and verified Lena's claim. Timestamps, record status, all untouched. The lead investigator gave a subtle nod, his gaze meeting Keller's not as an interrogator but as someone recognizing another human being capable of integrity. "We'll include this in the final report," he said. Voice softer now. "You may step out. If we need anything else, we'll contact you." Keller rose. His legs shook slightly, but his steps were sure. He walked out like someone who'd survived a silent crash, bloodless but leaving a cut that ran deep, and echoing in his mind a single sentence: he didn't lie. For the first time, Keller didn't question whether he had the courage. Lena had already answered for him. Keller stepped out of the hearing room like a man who had just walked through a toxic cloud. No smell, no smoke, but a burning weight left in his lungs. The hallway ahead wasn't crowded, just a few officers switching shifts. One passed by, glanced at him, and quickly turned away. Another, someone he'd had coffee with just 3 weeks earlier, walked past without a greeting, lips tight as if Keller had done something shameful. He stood there for a few seconds, gripping the metal railing, exhaled deeply, then walked away. He didn't tell himself things would be okay. He no longer believed in those hollow reassurances. But he knew one thing. He had just lost what once protected him from action: neutrality. And once that was gone, there was nothing left to hold on to, nor was there a need to. He returned to his desk, where no one sat nearby anymore. On his screen was the interface of the department's internal system: recent cases, templates, old records. No one had asked him to investigate. No one ordered him to do anything more. But he began pulling up every case he had ever filed for Carter and Sullivan. One by one, he ran extractions. Names of arrestees, dates and times, incident detail. He began marking them. Yellow, unverifiable details. Red, overwritten data. Blue, suspiciously repeated patterns. The same violations, the same reactions, the same wording copied and pasted across reports. With every entry, Keller wasn't just tracking others' misconduct, he was confronting his own silence, and this time, he didn't look away. As the afternoon light angled in through the office window, making the screen harder to read, Keller leaned back in his chair and stared at the top line of one report form. Subject displayed unusual behavior when stopped. He had typed that more than once. It used to be filler, copied-pasted, filed quickly to meet quotas, but now it read like an inverted indictment against himself. He thought of Lena's eyes when she looked at him in the holding cell. No hatred, no gratitude, just a deliberate gaze. And as he recalled her words, "No one is completely clean, but some choose to wash and others choose to add more mud," he knew he no longer had the option to stay neutral. He removed the badge from his shirt, a slow, deliberate motion, not to quit the force, but to re-enter it with a different definition. He placed the badge on the desk, stared at it for a long moment, then put it in a drawer, unlocked. Because from now on, he didn't need to lock anything away. He had chosen a side, and for the first time, he felt lighter, not because he was forgiven, but because he had chosen to carry the weight. On Monday morning, a 37-page document quietly appeared on the CIA's public data portal, buried among hundreds of technical reports like a stone resting at the bottom of a river. No press release, no briefing, just a static, verified encrypted link titled, "With clinical neutrality, correlation analysis between law enforcement and criminal deviations in county-level units." But the content was far from neutral. The report listed 43 cases showing procedural inconsistencies in arrests and prosecutions, 18 of them tied to 2 Arlington officers, Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan. The names weren't spelled out, but for anyone following the Lena Carter case, this was a clear, indirect validation of the claims she had exposed in court. That same afternoon, the Virginia State Supreme Court issued an emergency statement. Due to objective discrepancies and conflicts in the original data, the criminal case involving suspect Lena Carter is officially dismissed without condition. No exoneration ruling, no further hearings. The system chose the simplest route: stop, cut, withdraw. Lena was released that same afternoon. No escort, no cameras, no reporters waiting outside the precinct. Just Keller standing across the street, watching her walk out alone, carrying a cloth bag, dressed in dark clothes, as quietly as she had disappeared from public view. Contrary to expectations, Carter and Sullivan were not arrested. They were summoned to the State Department of Justice's Internal Affairs Office for clarification of actions related to the CIA report. Internal holding, not prosecution. No handcuffs. No mugshots. Local news outlets were silent. National networks were busy with a major traffic accident in a neighboring county. CNN, Fox, AP, none mentioned Lena Carter or the report. Only a handful of independent legal blogs picked it up with timid headlines like, "An unusual CIA report may be shaking courtrooms." The question mark suggesting even the writer wasn't sure if they were allowed to state it as fact. In a quiet Arlington suburb cafe, Keller sat alone with his laptop. He searched Lena Carter's name across mainstream platforms. Nothing. Then local news. Nothing. Social forums. Just a few posts taken down, now displaying a warning. This content is temporarily unavailable due to platform moderation policies. Keller wasn't a cybersecurity expert, but this was enough for him to know. This wasn't neglect. This was intentional containment. Someone or some entity was keeping the flames from spreading. No noise, no chaos, no reach. Meanwhile, Carter and Sullivan sat inside a stark white internal unit room. Across from them, a civilian-dressed investigator, calm, detached, didn't need to raise his voice, asked precise, concise questions directly tied to the CIA report. Carter remained composed. Sullivan began to sweat, but both knew the absence of handcuffs was a message. The game wasn't over, but the rules were now being rewritten by a different hand, one not from a holding cell, not from a courtroom, but from somewhere higher and far quieter. Lena didn't need long to understand that the silence surrounding her wasn't coincidence. It started with a few texts from acquaintances. "Was that you in the video?" Odd messages that came quickly, then vanished. Then a supportive comment thread on a small legal blog disappeared within hours. When Lena searched for the post, the only thing that came up was, "This content has been removed for security compliance." She tried sending Keller an archived copy. The link went dead. None of this surprised her. These were traces of a quiet cleanup, where information wasn't denied, just erased, so the public would have nothing to remember, nothing to argue about. At the state court office, an anonymous email arrived in the legal inbox. No signature, no name, just a chilling message. Publicly restoring Lena Carter's name will create a domino effect across other verdicts processed under the same system. We do not support undermining public confidence in the justice apparatus. We recommend discreet handling. It wasn't a direct threat, but the tone was clinical enough to make the clerk shiver. The letter was forwarded immediately to federal investigators, but no one knew what happened after that. What followed was nothing. No callbacks, no new orders, no extended inquiry. Everything seemed to freeze, an official lockdown triggered by the political choice that silence was the safest course. Keller tried calling Lena twice. Both times went to voicemail. On the third attempt, she picked up, voice calm. "I'm okay," she said, just waiting to see when truth is allowed to have a name. He wanted to ask more, but didn't, because he knew she had walked through a door most people never dared to open, and there was no way back. A quiet anger welled up in him, not because Lena wasn't being recognized, but because silence had been chosen as the system's official language. In a temporary rental on the outskirts of town, Lena sat alone in the living room. Light from the TV flickered over her bare face. No makeup, none of the sharpness she carried on the courtroom stand. Only eyes heavy, like someone who'd walked through a storm no one would admit had existed. She changed the channel. CNN covering an education summit. MSNBC, weather updates. Fox arguing over a new tax proposal. All smooth, all quiet. No mention of her. No suspect exonerated. No legal scandal in Arlington. No CIA report confirms misconduct, as if she had never existed in the records of justice. Lena muted the TV, then whispered something just loud enough for herself to hear. "When truth is buried in silence, I know I've struck the place that was meant to collapse." Night falls slowly in southern Georgia, casting harsh yellow light over dusty roads and wooden houses that sit still, as if time itself had forgotten them. Lena remembered the scene clearly. 3 years ago, she and Malik had been embedded in a small town called Jasper to investigate a bribery ring involving local police officers who turned a blind eye to drug and small arms trafficking. Malik played the role of a half-real, half-fake courier, running errands for local criminals. Lena posed as his fiancée, working at a bakery, memorizing every face that came near the police station. They planned to pull out after 4 weeks, once they had gathered enough evidence. But in the third week, everything collapsed. During a staged delivery, Malik was pulled over. 2 local officers dragged him out of his car, searched the trunk, and coincidentally found 2 bags of white powder hidden under the backseat liner, the exact scenario Lena would later see play out again in Arlington. She wasn't there when it happened. That night, she was monitoring surveillance feeds at a second location. By the time word reached her, Malik had already been placed in emergency custody, charged with possession of illegal substances, and prepped for criminal prosecution. Lena immediately triggered the priority channel. She sent Malik's route data, showing he never reached the drop point. She submitted identity verification, encrypted records proving he was a covert agent operating under CIA supervision, but the system responded slower than she expected. Her superiors asked for cross-verification. The Federal Investigation Office was conveniently on recess. Local offices claimed the files weren't strong enough to demand a release. Meanwhile, the prosecution pushed charges directly to court. The presiding judge, a man known for acquitting 2 officers previously accused of excessive force, ruled there is no compelling evidence to suggest the defendant is not a criminal actor. And so, within 72 hours, Malik, the man who had faced death beside her on 3 missions, the one with eyes that stayed calm even under threat, was sentenced to 90 days in pre-trial detention. Lena had hoped there was still time to reverse it. She submitted more files, called every unit that could intervene, but on the 17th day she received the news. Malik had died in custody, following a fight with 2 other inmates. The report cited a personal dispute. No one was charged. No one took responsibility. What etched the memory into her wasn't just the loss of a teammate. It was the moment Lena first understood. The system doesn't fail because it lacks evidence. It fails because it refuses to believe evidence that comes too early. She had tried to intervene, sent in location data and undercover credentials, but the system stalled. Malik lost because there was not enough basis for protection. Malik's eyes that day remained etched in Lena's memory, like a touch that could never be washed away. He was led down the narrow hallway of the local detention center, gray brick walls on either side, blank stares from guards ahead. But he didn't scream, didn't turn back, didn't try to leave final words. He turned his head once, and in that moment, his gaze, absent of fear, absent of anger, held a calm so cold it felt like he had seen this end long before it arrived. That look didn't plead for justice. It simply asked a wordless question. How long will it take for you to understand that silence saves no one? Lena never forgot it, and from that day on, it changed how she saw everything she was doing. There was a time when Lena believed that if she gathered enough evidence, wrote accurate enough reports, submitted them through the proper channels at the right time, then the system would work. Justice, she once thought, might be delayed, but it would come. But after Malik, that belief cracked. She spent countless sleepless nights asking herself, how could someone like him, careful, brave, loyal, die as if he had never existed? How could those who bent the truth, rewrote records, fabricated details, not only go unpunished, but continue climbing higher? Every time she asked, her mind returned to that final gaze, one without blame, but also without forgiveness. And gradually, the answers surfaced, because good people always think they can wait a little longer. One more report, one more confirmation, one more shot at hope. But Lena didn't want to wait anymore. Since the night she got the news about Malik's death, she began keeping everything, not because the system asked her to, but because she didn't trust it to protect the honest. Every audio file, every surveillance clip, every copied record, she stored her own versions. She learned to read the language of reports. Subject appeared nervous, uncooperative response, erratic behavior, phrases repeated without proof, only needing repetition to become precedent. And from these scattered fragments, Lena began to build a system of her own, invisible, without medals, without superiors to validate it. Just one rule. If you can't protect the good, at least don't let the system bury them beneath false paperwork. The answer had come slowly, because good people always think they can wait a little longer. But Lena was done waiting. Lena stood up. The small room around her remained silent, save for the soft ticking of the second hand brushing gently against the clock's frame. She walked slowly toward the corner, where an old, low wooden cabinet stood. The bottom drawer stuck slightly from years of humidity. She had to use both hands to pull it open. Inside, there was only a small wooden box. No lock, no label. She opened it and took out a single item, a small metal badge, slightly scratched along the edges, engraved with the name Malik R. Boone, her partner, who had fallen in an incident the report described as a situation beyond control. The badge had been retained during the internal investigation, then sent back to the CIA with a cold apology. No one had asked whether she wanted to keep it, but she did not as a keepsake, but as a question that had never been answered. She clenched it in her palm, feeling the chill of the metal sink into her skin. No tears, no sobbing, just a weight of emotion sinking like a stone dropped into a deep well. Outsiders might call her cold. They might say she had grown used to death, to loss, to good people being silenced without a sound. But only Lena knew. The hardest part wasn't the pain. It was keeping the fire inside from being extinguished by endless silence. Every time she stood before the name of someone framed, every time she read a file with a deliberately falsified timestamp, she felt herself inching closer to the edge. But she never crossed it, because if she ever let that fire go out, everything Malik once believed in and died for would lose its meaning. Lena sat at the table and placed the badge carefully on the wooden surface, like an anchor. In front of her sat an old laptop, keys worn down but its encrypted system still running as precisely as it had on day one. She opened a new file. No sender name, no official header, just a single opening line, unofficial report. For those whose voices were cut off in the halls of justice. This time she wasn't writing for superiors. She wasn't uploading into a system she knew had once looked away. She was writing for those still waiting for justice, not knowing if anyone would ever hear them. Those without Lena beside them, without a recorder, without a chance to bring the truth back into the light. She wrote to keep the fire alive, so that every time she looked at the badge on the table, she would remember she wasn't alone, and so that Malik, though no longer here, would remain the reason she could never afford to stop. She set the badge on the table, opened the laptop, and continued the report, this time not for the chain of command, but for those still without a voice. Wednesday morning, just after the minute hand slid past 7:05, two unmarked black SUVs crept into the rear parking lot of the Arlington Police Department. They were followed by three light gray sedans, tinted windows and unmarked doors. No sirens, no alarms, no dramatic megaphones like in the movies. Just movements so perfectly timed, so eerily synchronized, they felt unnatural, because no one inside had been warned. The people who stepped out wore dark suits. No name tags. They didn't storm in. They walked directly to the main administrative wing, presented a file stamped in red, and said 4 words, "We have a warrant." The officer at the front desk barely managed to stand up, ready to ask a question, but the lead agent's stare was enough to silence him. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to execute. The comprehensive search warrant, signed by the federal court the night before, authorized the FBI to gain immediate access to all devices, documents, and data under the Arlington Police Department's control. At exactly 7:08, the internal network was disconnected from the federal coordination infrastructure. All login credentials were temporarily disabled, including admin-level access. Officers' monitors across the building went black, then displayed a red warning: access suspended pending federal audit. Printers shut down. Internal phones rerouted. A group of technicians with their own equipment entered the server room, a space previously managed by a single administrator. No one raised their voice. No one ran, but the entire building began to feel like an invisible hand had pressed its fingers to the system's windpipe. In the West Wing operations area, Carter and Sullivan were seated in an internal hearing. No one had warned them. They were still answering procedural questions, until the door opened without a knock. A clerk stepped in, handed a sealed envelope to the lead investigator, and whispered something. His face changed instantly. Carter frowned and tried to rise, but was told to stay seated. "Continue," the investigator said, but his tone was now firmer, stripped of courtesy. In the hallway outside, a few officers started whispering, sneaking glances through the glass. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone sensed one thing. This wasn't an administrative review. It was a purge, and it hadn't come to ask permission. Carter and Sullivan were stuck mid-hearing, no time to react. Around them, confusion quietly began to spread. In the criminal data archives of the Arlington Police Department, normally staffed by just 2 people per shift, the atmosphere shifted sharply when the FBI's Special Task Force entered with their own equipment cases. No lengthy explanations were offered. A signed presence order was placed on the desk, and the agents proceeded directly to the digital records vault, which housed detainment logs, field reports, and processing entries from the past 18 months. In their hands was a list of more than 50 cases, all involving minority individuals. The common thread? Rapid arrests, sparse statements, and numerous instances where entries were rewritten rather than updated logically. A proprietary FBI software began scanning metadata in each report, including timestamps of access, edits, and last user activity. And one by one, the inconsistencies surfaced. Reports updated before suspects were even formally questioned. A young agent from the forensic team approached the desk of Lieutenant Harold Danvers, a veteran officer with over 25 years of service, known for overseeing case file sorting and numerous investigations. Danvers frowned as the FBI team began searching his external hard drive, equipment that technically wasn't department-issued but had been borrowed for backup purposes. "That's personal equipment. It's outside the search scope," he objected, voice steady. But the agent simply handed him an annex, clearly stating authorization to access any device used to retrieve or copy data belonging to the Arlington Police Department's system. Danvers kept a composed face, but his hands trembled slightly as he disconnected the cables. It was too late to delete anything. The FBI hadn't come to negotiate. They were here to peel back every layer of concealment, and Danvers, though not yet accused, knew his years of flexible data management might soon turn into a burden. Just as the tension peaked, a man entered through the back door of the data room. Slim, young, wearing glasses and a pale blue button-down instead of a uniform. A few officers flinched at the sight of him. The face was familiar, but it was a face that had once vanished. His name was Noah Beale, a former technician in the Internal Systems Division, suspended 8 months ago for unauthorized access to confidential data. But now he wasn't a suspect. He walked in alongside the FBI as a witness. No one needed to say it aloud. His presence, along with the special clearance badge clipped to his belt, made it clear Noah wasn't here to run diagnostics. He was here to point out who did what and who altered what. In an analysis room deep beneath the FBI's Eastern Division headquarters, dozens of monitors displayed simultaneous data streams. Internal audio logs, hallway surveillance footage, system login histories, and internal emails collected over the past 72 hours. A time-stamped cross-referencing program was linking seemingly harmless fragments. A report edited 12 minutes after the suspect signed off on it. An audio clip capturing laughter between Carter and Sullivan after a successful arrest. A grainy hallway video showing an officer quietly slipping out of the data room past midnight on their own. Each piece might be explained away, but stitched together they formed a blueprint of deliberate manipulation, not personal error, but a repeated, protected pattern upheld by collective compromise. No one called it a coincidence anymore. The preliminary report was forwarded to the Federal Independent Prosecutor's Office, an agency tasked with investigating systemic misconduct in public institutions. It didn't take them long to request a full case opening. Though Lena had been formally suspended from her role as a field agent, she was invited in to advise on media strategy and documentation. She sat among a circle of attorneys, analysts, and senior investigation coordinators, some of whom had once doubted her, now listening intently to every word. She didn't boast. She didn't claim victory. She simply pointed out repeated linguistic patterns in the reports, inconsistencies in timestamps, and changes in handwriting across file copies. Every tiny detail, every faint sound, every switch between blue ink and black helped paint a picture not of a few rogue officers, but of a system built on the belief that silence was an everlasting shield. When the session paused, a young FBI agent stepped out into the hallway and spoke quietly to a colleague waiting near the coffee machine. "I used to think it would take some massive explosion to bring a system down," he said, sliding his keycard from his pocket. "But now I get it. It's not the big bangs that break the machine. It's the small, repeated sounds over the years that finally crack it apart." That sentence never made it into a press briefing. It wasn't quoted on any news ticker, but it moved quietly through the people involved in the investigation, like a late-coming warning to those who once believed what they were doing was too small for anyone to notice. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if trying to count every crack. The interrogation had dragged on for nearly 3 hours, and most of his answers followed a familiar, empty script. I don't remember. I followed procedure. I was just following orders from above. But everything shifted when an investigator placed before him the access log from the internal system, a document showing Sullivan among the group involved in repeatedly editing case files over the span of a single week. He froze. "I didn't write that alone," he muttered, eyes avoiding contact. "Back then, Warren told me to do it." The name hit the room like a drop in temperature. Lieutenant Martin Warren, formerly in charge of administrative personnel coordination, had left over a year ago under the vague banner of internal restructuring. He wasn't investigated, never tied to any scandal, and vanished from official memory as if he'd never existed in the eyes of the system. The federal investigation team immediately reopened internal email archives from the past 18 months. The results were clear. Warren's name appeared in over 70 email threads linked to optimizing temporary detention procedures, prioritizing fast-track removal of repeat offenders, and a side thread labeled simply SIFT, short for Screen, Isolate, Fast Track. There were no direct commands, but the language, the phrasing, and the way subordinates cited him as a kind of directive source made one thing evident. Warren wasn't just relaying policy. He was shaping the blueprint for an entire operational framework designed to push cases through predetermined outcomes. Officers who had once remained silent now began to speak up, confirming that Warren often used the phrase "orders from above" when urging them to act on sensitive arrests. No one ever dared to ask who above meant. In the audio archive, a recording from an internal meeting 14 months earlier was recovered. The sound was faint, but the deep, clipped voice was unmistakable. It was Warren. Speaking to a room of mid-level officers, he delivered a statement with chilling clarity. "You don't need to convince anyone. We're not here to do press. We're not here for PR. We just need to make sure the target has no options left." A short sentence, but one that carried the weight of an entire operational doctrine, one that had swept countless individuals into a system with no exits. And now it surfaced again, not as evidence from a whistleblower, not through a leaked report, but as a memory, deliberately pushed outside the official record, yet never truly gone. The FBI's Financial Analysis Division, operating under direct orders from the federal office, began dissecting the Arlington Police Department's operational budget over the past 3 years. Amid hundreds of administrative expenses, from patrol car maintenance to printer ink, stood out a string of entries labeled as community security workshops, conflict de-escalation training in densely populated zones, and high-risk behavioral counseling program. All were billed to an entity named Civic Stability Group, registered in Delaware, with no website, no public event record. Each workshop lasted only 1 day, and no one at the department could recall any specific content. What raised red flags? After every session, there was a sharp spike in arrests labeled drug discovery during traffic stops, as if officers had been subtly encouraged or trained to optimize enforcement tactics that justified aggressive policing under procedural legitimacy. Following the money trail, investigators discovered that Civic Stability Group was, in fact, a consultancy unit nested within the corporate structure of Centurion Response, an organization previously investigated for supplying protest control strategies to various counties across Florida and Texas. Internal documents from Centurion revealed their scope extended beyond security training. They also provided instruction in public narrative shaping and rapid legal response models for law enforcement agencies. A never-before-published PDF referred to case framing guidance as a soft tactic, allowing police systems to maintain dominance in so-called hard-to-control communities. When the FBI pulled the regional consultant registry for 2019-2021, one name resurfaced: Martin Warren, listed as the local deployment coordinator. His name was directly tied to pilot programs in 3 small towns, Arlington among them. Expanded financial data revealed that the Arlington workshops had been funded by a private trust named Local Security Innovation Trust, LSIT, a financial entity operated by a major investment group based in Chicago known to have close ties to regional politicians. Marketed as a regional safety support fund, LSIT had no transparent reporting on how its disbursements to private contractors were managed. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer the picture became. Civic Stability Group was merely the first mask. Behind it lay an intricate web of companies, organizations, and financial instruments functioning under a shared principle, a theoretically good initiative followed by a chain of managed, real-world consequences. Their mission was never explicitly stated as suppression, but as stability. And in their definition, stability meant keeping minority-heavy zones from becoming a concern to the rest of the majority. This firm had direct affiliations with a specialized advisory body for protest response and community stabilization in high-minority population areas. Lena opened the file, delivered via encrypted channel, no sender address, no traceable path. Inside was a list, names of towns, dates of consultation programs, local coordinators, funding sources. Arlington was just one of many. At least 14 other regions, spread across states from east to west, had launched similar initiatives, all bearing the same strange pattern, the same seminar company, the same rhetoric of transforming law enforcement processes, and the same results. Spikes and arrests of Black and Latinx individuals, unusually high conviction rates, and all community feedback labeled as irrational or emotion-driven. In some areas, those who spoke up had been countersued for defaming public officials. The document also showed that many individuals in these command chains, though listed under different titles or agencies, had direct ties to the same advisory groups or funding sources involved in Arlington. Sitting before the laptop, Lena rested her hand on her forehead, eyes locked on the final 3 lines of the file. There is no official leader. No one signs off on wrongdoing, but everyone agrees. When data is rewritten, truth must wait its turn. The words chilled her, because that was exactly how the system worked, not by hiding itself, but by legitimizing silence through collective consent. Warren wasn't the mastermind. He was an efficient gear, obedient, discreet, always stepping back just enough to avoid being recorded. So when he withdrew, the system didn't fall. It simply paused, waiting for a successor. This wasn't a mafia-style operation. It was a structure without a center, no one fully accountable, yet everyone maintaining their place. Lena understood then. Dismantling this would require exposing the mechanism, not just the man turning the wheel. Keller sat beside Lena in their temporary safe house, eyes fixed on the screen. He said nothing for a long time. Since joining the investigation, he had felt fear, shame, then anger. But today, confronted with the scale and repetition of it all, there was only one thing left: shock. "So who are we fighting, really?" he asked, voice low and raw, not expecting a simple answer. Lena looked directly at him, unblinking. Her gaze no longer carried warning, nor was it cold. It was the steadiness of something that had passed through fire. "Not a person," she said, "but the way a system survives, by crushing what doesn't fit." The Arlington District Courtroom was packed that day. Unlike the usual dry hearings, this one drew media, citizen representatives, and a reserved row for family members of cases under review. The public hearing was part of a broader initiative led by the Office of Independent Prosecutorial Oversight, created to gather testimony from those who had once worked inside the system and might hold key information. James Keller, formerly a records officer at the Arlington Police Department, was called as the main witness. He entered the courtroom in a plain white shirt, no uniform, no badge, but every eye turned to him as if he were the accused. A few former colleagues sat in the back, faces tense, some skeptical, some cold, but they all shared one thing: They weren't used to seeing someone from their own on the other side. Keller stepped up to the witness stand, adjusted the mic. No one asked him to apologize. No one required a confession. But he spoke anyway, opening with a sentence so bare it chilled the room. "I used to be part of the silence." No one replied, but the atmosphere dropped like something invisible had collapsed in the middle of the courtroom. He didn't look down. Didn't search for sympathy. His voice was steady. "I used to process files like a machine. I read the same lines repeated across reports and never asked why. I heard colleagues joke about the arrests, and I laughed along." He paused. "I wasn't threatened. I just chose not to question. And that's when I started helping it happen." A reporter lifted a camera. A woman in the audience covered her mouth. An older officer in the last row leaned forward, hands tightening around his hat. His testimony wasn't an indictment, nor was it a defense. It was a kind of unmasking, not to invite judgment, but to stop hiding from himself. In a system where everyone claimed they were just following orders, Keller was the first to say the simplest thing: "I knew, but I stayed quiet." And that admission, without denial, without excuses, was what made the courtroom go completely still. Because lies can be argued, but the naked truth needs no defense. It only needs to be acknowledged. The courtroom held its breath because this wasn't a confession. It was the moment a man took off his mask. Keller didn't use words like, "I was wrong," or "I'm sorry." Not out of avoidance, but because he knew they weren't enough to patch over what had been ignored. Instead, he continued his testimony with specifics. "I used to process 3 to 5 reports a day, sometimes more. They were written the same way, formatted the same way, and worded the same way. I copy-pasted to save time. Each case was just a number in the system, not a person." A few in the courtroom shifted in their seats. Some glanced at one another. A young officer furrowed his brow and dropped his head, as if to deny what he was hearing. But Keller went on. "No one told me to do that. No one ordered me to ignore red flags. I wasn't threatened. I just didn't have the courage to question." His voice wasn't loud or trembling, but steady, sharp, like a small blade slicing through the layers of self-preserving narratives the system had wrapped around its uniformed members. He spoke of pre-checked boxes on forms, fields like suspicious behavior marked before any facts were confirmed, moments he saw inaccurate timestamps and left them uncorrected. "Because I thought fixing it wouldn't change anything," he admitted. There were no attempts to shift blame upward. No names offered to share the weight. Keller turned the light on himself, not to glorify, but to expose. Some reporters started scribbling faster. Others stopped writing altogether, just listening. What Keller said wasn't new, but it had never been said from the inside, and that's why each sentence hit with the weight of stone. When Keller happened to mention one specific case, a black teenager arrested for resisting, though a video clearly showed the boy stepping back out of fear, a soft sob broke the silence in the back row. A middle-aged woman with curly hair clutched her handbag, tears falling freely, unhidden. She didn't speak, but her gaze toward Keller was enough for everyone to understand. She was that boy's mother. The boy had served 6 months on fabricated charges. He was out now, but the record remained. And no one had ever said sorry. Keller paused, locking eyes with her, then nodded slightly, as if to shoulder a silent admission of guilt. The courtroom was divided, some admiring his courage, others questioning his motive, but no one left, because what he said sounded far too much like the thoughts they had once had, but never dared to voice. The next day, headlines began to appear on digital news platforms. Not sensational, not loud, just compact, oddly striking titles that stood out nonetheless. An officer maps the gray within himself. Not betrayal, but belated courage. James Keller, the man standing at the divide. One local newspaper ran a feature calling him the officer who stepped across the line while others stayed frozen by fear. Not because he was the first to know the truth, but because he was the first to name it from the other side. No longer the detective, no longer the enforcer, but the one who saw the disorder within the very order he once believed was unshakable. Elsewhere, in a dimly lit room with white walls, Lena sat on a wooden chair, her laptop resting on her knees, replaying the hearing where Keller stood at the witness stand. No one else is around, no applause, no audible sighs, just her and the screen. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes for a long moment when she heard Keller end his statement with, "I was never a hero, but now I choose not to assist." For her, that was enough to know that the seed she had once planted, with a look, a question, a recording, had taken root, not to change the world, but to give someone inside the machinery a reason to pause and choose differently. Maybe he wasn't the bravest, but he was clear-eyed enough to realize if silence is a wound, then speaking is the way to stop the bleeding. The hearing ended without applause. Keller exited through a side door, where a few journalists waited. One of them, a reporter from an independent investigative outlet, stepped quickly forward, recorder in hand, and asked, "What do you think of yourself today?" Keller stopped, didn't turn away, didn't rush ahead. He paused for a few seconds, then answered slowly, "I'm not better, I'm just not hiding anymore." A short answer. No grand gestures, no polish, but it was the one thing no one else could say for him. A man who had seen wrong and stood up to say, "I was there." No one knew where Keller would go next, or what he would do, but in that moment, he was no longer a quiet shadow in the records room. He was a mirror, not glossy, but real. And for those who've lived in the dark, sometimes that's all they need. At 7 a.m., the Arlington suburb was still quiet. Lawns damp with dew, windows shut tight. Two black SUVs pulled up in front of Brandon Carter's brick three-bedroom home, the same house that once flew an American flag on the porch every weekend. 3 federal agents stepped out, unhurried. One pulled a warrant from a leather folder and knocked 3 times. Carter opened the door 10 seconds later. Not in uniform, not armed. Just a middle-aged man in a faded t-shirt and sweatband. He looked at the warrant, asked nothing, and exhaled slowly. When instructed to turn around and place his hands behind his back, he complied. No resistance, no words. Neighbors peeked through the curtains. A woman stood on the porch across the street, holding a coffee mug. No one shouted. No one said, "It can't be." No one stepped forward in defense, because everyone knew Carter hadn't represented the law in a long time. He was now simply a man, no longer shielded by it. The indictment listed 7 charges: abuse of authority, evidence tampering, report fraud, unlawful detainment, false internal statements, manipulation of arrest outcomes, and constitutional rights violations. Each charge cited a specific federal statute. Nothing vague, nothing open to interpretation. These charges didn't form overnight. They were the result of dozens of incidents, hundreds of reports, and at least 3 overlapping investigations. A year ago, no one imagined Carter would be named. 6 months ago, he still walked into the precinct with untouchable confidence, but today, he stood on his lawn, wrists locked in standard-issue cuffs. No badge number, no ceremony, no sirens, no drawn guns, but nothing left to protect him. As he stepped off his porch, Carter didn't lower his head, but the arrogance once alive in his stare, the look that used to freeze people mid-interrogation, was gone. Now his eyes were hollow, not remorseful, not angry, just empty, as if something inside had shut off. On the ride to federal detention, he said nothing. Only when handed a pen to write his initial statement did he move, slowly, writing a few short lines. Among them, one sentence appeared twice. "I was just following orders." He didn't say who gave them, didn't name a source. But that sentence, in cold ink, was the clearest confession of all. Carter didn't act alone. He was a shield. And today, the shield has been removed. Mark Sullivan wasn't cuffed at his front door. There was no warrant, no police, no cameras waiting. Instead, he received a sealed envelope from the Office of Internal Affairs, an official notice of indefinite suspension citing professional misconduct through facilitation and failure to prevent evident wrongdoing. No one came to take him away, but the letter was enough to sever him from the life he'd lived for over a decade. He folded it, placed it in a drawer, and didn't leave his house for 2 days. His internal account was locked. His badge was revoked. No messages came through. Colleagues who once drank beer with him after shifts no longer replied to his texts. Suddenly, Sullivan became a void in the department, not severe enough to prosecute, but too heavy to ignore. The collapse didn't begin with screams. It started with sleepless nights. When every small noise sounded like a knock at the door, he drank more coffee but never felt awake. He wrote emails, then deleted them, opened his laptop, then shut it. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man graying faster than normal, eyes ringed in darkness. One evening, parked alone in an empty lot, he screamed, slamming his fists against the dashboard until his knuckles bled. Someone filmed it and posted it on an anonymous forum with the caption, "When the system won't punish you, but your conscience does." The video spread slowly. It didn't go viral, but it wasn't deleted either. Quietly, it became part of his Google history, an unofficial record without a single charge. More than a month later, an independent journalist requested a short interview. Sullivan didn't decline. He didn't push back. He simply sat there, unshaven, unguarded, and answered only one question. If you could go back, would you do it differently? He didn't look at the camera. He stared at the table, where faded scars still marked his hand. Then he spoke, barely louder than a sigh. "At first, I just wanted to keep my place, but then it all went too far." No applause followed. No one called him brave, but within communities that had long stayed silent, that sentence rang like a church bell in the dark. Sullivan became the face of the man who stayed quiet too long and couldn't get out. No one dragged him down. He stayed, and the door closed behind him, no lock required. Roy Dilliard didn't make headlines. No photos of him exiting the court with cameras flashing. Instead, a letter of retirement citing health reasons was submitted to the State Judicial Oversight Board, along with a polite note thanking the institution for allowing him to fulfill his duties for nearly 3 decades. No press conference, no farewell speech, just a few lines as cold as snow, placed over a career once described as exemplary, aggressive, and uncompromising on crime. But now, that same uncompromising stance was being scrutinized as a mechanism to sustain a biased adjudication model. His name had been linked to at least 37 rulings showing signs of judicial imbalance, many involving defendants of color, most of whom lost their cases after deliberations that lasted mere minutes. He hadn't been charged, but he was ordered to submit all rulings from the past 5 years for federal review. Legally, it wasn't a conviction, but in legal circles everyone knew this was how legacies were dismantled, quietly, without a public declaration. Dillard didn't fight it. He made no appearance to defend his record. Days after his resignation, his office was cleared. The nameplate was removed. No one asked to keep it. Those who had once worked under him split into 2 camps. One said he stepped away just in time. The other, smaller but louder in whispers, told each other, for the first time, his gavel couldn't control the room. No one saw Dillard leave the courthouse on his final day. Some said he flew to Florida. Others claimed he moved in with his daughter in Vermont. But in Arlington, the name Roy Dillard began vanishing from legal discussions. Not erased, just unspoken. Only one investigative column mentioned him again. No photo, no hashtags, just a single closing line, left like a quiet verdict. Truth doesn't kill. It only leaves those who lived by lies with nowhere left to stand. Starting Monday, cream-colored envelopes stamped with the red seal of the Arlington District Court began appearing quietly in the mailboxes of people once sentenced during the tenure of Officers Carter and Sullivan. No warning, no headlines, just a letter, thin, but heavy with the weight of lost years. The content was consistent. Following a review by the Office of Independent Prosecutorial Oversight, the District Court hereby nullifies verdict no ________. We also extend a formal apology for systemic errors in the trial process. You are entitled to request the expungement of your criminal record and the restoration of all affected civil rights. The letter was plain, no embellishment, no long explanations. But to the recipients, it was a long denial confirmation that the years spent, labeled as dangerous, defiant, or resisting arrest, were finally seen for what they were, the years of being a victim. In East Arlington, in an old housing block, Mrs. Mabel, a black woman in her 60s who once received a suspended sentence for interfering with police while trying to stop them from dragging her 12-year-old grandson out of her backyard, sat quietly on her wooden chair. She read the letter 3 times, slower each time. She didn't cry, but her fingers trembled as she folded it. At a community meeting years ago, she once said, "I don't need an apology. I just need them to stop." Today, the apology arrived, late but not meaningless. In another part of the city, a mechanic read his letter, then burned it, not out of rage, but because he said, "I won't keep anything that reminds me I was turned into a criminal for driving down the wrong street." And others quietly filed their letters away, among divorce papers, termination notices, and everything else they lost because of a single wrongful conviction. Then came the moments when silence couldn't hold emotion. In a ground-floor apartment near the city's old Latinx market, Tomas Alvarez, once convicted of resisting after shielding his 14-year-old son during a violent search, opened his letter, read it, and sat still for a long time. The letter was signed by a new judge, younger, including an official apology and a pledge to make amends. Alvarez didn't know who this judge was, but when he saw the still wet ink on the signature, he broke down. No sobbing, no noise, just the tears of a man who finally felt seen, who finally knew the hug he gave his son that night wasn't a criminal act. He placed the letter on the table, reached for an old photo of his son on the wall, and gently wiped the dust from the glass. In his heart, he said no words of forgiveness, but at least now, he knew he was no longer outside the edges of the truth. Luis Ramos never got his letter. His name appeared on the list of 42 vacated convictions, marked with a note, "Deceased during sentence." 3 years ago, Luis was arrested for drug possession, based on Officer Carter's statement, and sentenced by Judge Dillard in less than 5 minutes. Luis had severe asthma, always carried an inhaler, but on his first night in holding, he was denied medication. When the attack came, he banged on the door, called for help, but no one responded in time. By morning, he was dead. The local news wrote only, "A detainee with pre-existing conditions died in custody. No signs of foul play." And the story vanished, like so many deaths that make no noise behind jail walls. 3 years later, his wife Sophia received an envelope from the court. No warning, no call, just a letter signed by someone she'd never met, beginning with, "The court deeply regrets the systemic failures that contributed to the tragic outcome in the case of Mr. Luis Ramos." She stood at his grave, letter smudged from the moisture in her palms. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. She read each line aloud, not for him to hear, but for herself, to finally accept that someone had looked at his death and no longer called it a tragic error. When she reached the final line, she folded the letter, placed it on the grave, and whispered, "You used to say you just wanted one more chance to tell your side. You don't need to anymore." There was no rage in her voice, no vengeance, but no forgiveness either. Just the quiet end of a wait too long endured, a response arriving after the one who asked for it was no longer alive to hear it. Beside her stood their daughter, 9 years old, in a red sweater, holding Sophia's hand from beginning to end. The girl didn't understand all the words in the letter, but she recognized her father's name, recognized the court symbol, recognized her mother's voice was different today. When her mother bent down to pick up the letter, the girl asked, Not shy, not scared. If they believe Dad now, why didn't they listen back then? Sophia looked at her daughter, throat tightening. She had no answer. She'd asked herself the same thing for 3 years. The court had finally written back. But to a child who lost her father to silence, that question, like a needle, remained untouched by any apology. There was no special news segment. No press conference with a spokesperson, or a young judge reading words of regret into a microphone. When the list of overturned cases went live on the court's website, it appeared under a small tab. Case data updated per request from Prosecutorial Review Board. No dramatic headline. No highlighted tags. Major news outlets barely noticed. Only a few independent legal bloggers shared it, adding, "Delayed justice for those whose lives were stolen by one wrong line in a police report." It meant something. But to the rest of society, those who once looked away, this victory happened too quietly to be called a victory. The truth didn't die, but it wasn't celebrated either. A few volunteer legal groups began setting up support lines to help people clear their records, especially in wrongful resisting arrest cases. But the process was slow. Some files were lost. Some victims had no original documents left. Others didn't even know they had the right to ask. People arrived for consultations with plastic bags holding aluminum ID cards, old bills, faded photos, as if showing enough proof of being human might be enough to erase the stain. A young lawyer said, "The system is fast to convict, but painfully slow to undo it." Notary offices overflowed. Some had to schedule 2 weeks in advance just to start the paperwork. Justice, though on its way, still had to wait for a green light. Lena sat alone in her small rented room. 2 lists in front of her. One held the names of those just declared innocent, confirmed, signed, sealed. The other, no stamp, no sign, off, was a list of those who died before justice could call their name. She stared at that second list, each name a new crease on her forehead. Each passing day brought justice closer, but also took something unrecoverable. She opened her worn notebook, flipped to a blank page and wrote a single line. No address, no preface. Truth can stand up, but no one sets out a chair for it. She closed the notebook and turned off the light. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the road for those once pushed into the dark to finally step into the light still had no path laid out. The sky was still dim when Lena stepped out of the small apartment on the southern edge of Arlington. A worn 2-story brick building with paper-thin windows, once a refuge for people who didn't want to be found. She had rented the apartment under a false name. No ID, no neighbors, and on that morning, like the way she had arrived, she left without a sound. No footsteps, no farewells, no glances back. Just an old rolling suitcase, a fabric bag, and a weathered laptop. The same one that held evidence capable of shaking an entire system. The landlord nodded silently when she handed over the key. He didn't ask questions. Her eyes weren't those of an ordinary tenant. They belonged to someone who understood that meaning doesn't require recognition. The apartment was left nearly bare. On the table, beside a folded bedsheet and an empty cup, was a handwritten note. "I'm not here to make change. I'm just here to make sure change doesn't get stopped." It wasn't a farewell or a declaration, just a final sentence, for whoever might wonder who she was. The answer, like Lena herself, was never meant to be documented. And those who had met her? Keller, a few pro bono lawyers, a mother whose son's record had been cleared, now found only missed calls, unanswered texts. She disappeared like a passing wind, but left a mark that wouldn't fade. Keller heard she had left from a receptionist. He skipped his morning shift, drove straight there while the sky was still gray. He ran up the stairs before the car engine cooled. The apartment was empty. The smell of coffee still lingered. The note remained on the table. Nothing else. He sat down, touched the cold tabletop. No one in town really knew who Lena was or where she came from, but anyone who had looked into her eyes, in court, in holding, was no longer the same. And now Keller, the last one left still asking, wondered, why didn't she stay? But the note had already answered that. No names, no closure, just a door left open for something called change to walk through. At the terminal, morning light filtered through grimy windows. The station was quiet. Lena stood alone near a bench, gray coat, backpack, worn suitcase. When Keller arrived, breathless, she didn't look surprised. She just looked at him, as if she had always known he'd come and that he wouldn't stop her. "So, where are you going?" Keller asked, hands in his pockets. Lena smiled lightly, not dismissive, but not answering either. "To the next place where someone's being forced into silence." It wasn't a plan, it was who she was. Keller nodded. He didn't need more. He had seen how she moved, how she held on to fragments of truth others tried to erase. He understood. She wasn't built to stay still while injustice continued. And when he asked softly, "What's your real name?" she didn't answer, just tilted her head slightly, eyes soft, like wind brushing still water, then turned away. Her real name didn't matter. It wasn't something to be remembered. It was something she chose to give up so others could step forward. When the boarding call came, she climbed the bus steps, but before going inside, she turned, not to say goodbye, but to leave one final truth. "I didn't come to be remembered. I came so no one would be forgotten." Then she was gone. The door closed softly. No horn, no lights. But for Keller, it sounded like the end of a chapter, so a new one could begin without her, but in a town that could never go back. That afternoon, Keller returned to the precinct, something he once told himself he wouldn't do. But as he walked the familiar hallway, he stopped. At the records desk, a young officer was combing through old files, not skimming, but reading, line by line. In the community room, a volunteer lawyer explained civil rights with a whiteboard, and a small group quietly taking notes. No microphones, no camera. But Keller knew this place wasn't the same. No one mentioned Lena, no one recited her story, but something had shifted. The way people asked questions, the way they no longer looked down at forms filled with vague language. Her presence wasn't in photos, but in the air itself. He walked past the reception desk, pausing at the glass door that reflected his silhouette. In that reflection, he no longer saw a man who once trembled when asked, "Do you really believe you're doing the right thing?" He was no longer just a witness, no longer a bystander. He was someone who had seen the truth and chose not to turn away. And somewhere in his mind, a voice rose, not his, not Lena's, but something bigger than both of them, a quiet acknowledgement of every quiet awakening never written down. Some people don't come to be honored, they just open the door, then quietly leave. There are stories that don't need gunfire to be loud, and don't need spotlights to endure. The story of Lena Carter is one of them. At first glance, she seemed like another name in a long list of marginalized victims. A black woman arrested in the middle of the night by two police officers who planted drugs in her car. To many, it looked routine, familiar, predictable. But what they didn't know was this: Lena Carter was a CIA operative, and survival wasn't her endgame. Her mission was to reveal a system that didn't just fail the vulnerable, it thrived by silencing them. What began as a fabricated charge gradually unraveled into something much bigger, a web of wrongful convictions, patterns of abuse cloaked as routine enforcement, and a machinery of manipulated justice sustained by years of collective silence. If it had stopped there, perhaps it would have remained a high-profile case. But this story lingers, not because of its size, but because of what it forces us collectively to reconsider. The first and most immediate lesson is this: never rush to judge someone through the lens of bias. Lena was not seen as trustworthy, not because of what she did, but because of how she looked, how she acted, and how she didn't fit the expected mold of an innocent person. She didn't plead, she didn't panic, she didn't perform her pain for validation. That silence, that restraint, that calm defiance, it wasn't weakness, it was strength, rooted in clarity. And it was that same clarity, paired with evidence she gathered at great risk, that tore open the doors of a system that had long convinced itself it was untouchable. Her quiet became the lever that moved the immovable. The second lesson is about value, the kind that's often unseen until it's needed most. It's about the power of individuals, especially those overlooked, underestimated or ignored. Lena wasn't the only one. James Keller, too, a junior officer once complicit in a flawed system, not only stepped out of its shadow but stood in front of it. He admitted his failure, not under pressure, not for recognition. He said plainly, "I was part of the silence." That sentence didn't erase his past, but it gave meaning to his present. His courage didn't come with applause. No medals were waiting, but his willingness to break from the status quo became an example of what redemption looks like in real time. Being good doesn't mean being flawless. It means having the humility and strength to face what you once ignored and choose differently. That kind of transformation is what real reform requires. Not perfect people, but people willing to change. The third lesson, and perhaps the hardest to hold on to, is that justice does eventually rise. Not always quickly, not painlessly, but it does. It may take time. It may arrive through cracks, not gates. It may cost people their comfort, their careers, their illusions, but the truth has a habit of surfacing, no matter how deeply buried. In Lena's case, the lies were exposed. The wrongfully accused were heard. The powerful were named. But perhaps most importantly, those who had been pushed aside were finally seen, not through grand ceremonies, but through quiet shifts. A junior officer reopening a dusty file. A grieving mother finally able to speak on behalf of a son who never got to. Those moments aren't dramatic, but they're real, and they are how justice moves forward, inch by inch, life by life. From one woman's ordeal, we saw the anatomy of a system powered by passive complicity and institutional neglect. Lena didn't come to be a hero. She never claimed the spotlight. She simply did what was necessary, and when she left, something in the town she touched could no longer return to how it had been. Her presence made denial impossible. And that is what real justice looks like. Not the loud crash of vengeance, but the quiet, steady rhythm of truth, repeated until the silence can no longer hold. So now the question shifts to us. Have you ever been misread, misjudged, treated as less than what you truly are, just because someone saw only the surface? Have you ever felt the sting of being dismissed, only to quietly prove that you were more than they expected? If so, then you already understand part of the injustice others live through every day. And if Lena's story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, question the way things work around you, then don't let that recognition disappear into silence. Share this story, whether it's a repost, a conversation, a video, or a whispered retelling. Every time this truth is passed on, it takes one more step away from the shadows. Comment, reach out, ask questions. You don't need a title or a platform to start a shift. You just need to be the person who doesn't look away. And if you believe, as we do, that justice doesn't come from power, but from faith, vigilance, and endurance, then follow this channel. We don't tell stories for attention. We tell them to keep something vital alive. Trust, thoughtfulness, and courage. Because justice is not a destination, it's a path. And every person who walks it, eyes open, spine straight, brings us one step closer to a world that forgets fewer people, buries fewer truths, and leaves fewer wounds behind.